All right, guys, I'm LQ. We are back with the LQ review to do a little commentary today. So, I have heard lots of people say that they thought that the X-Men universe done by Fox Studios is garbage, that none of the X-Men movies are good, and that they cannot wait until X-Men ends up back in the hands of Marvel, because only Marvel knows how to properly take care of these characters. All right? So, I'm going to take the unpopular opinion, and I'm going to say that the X-Men movies were great overall. There were some bad X-Men movies in there to be certain, but the vast majority of them were very good. So let's talk about them. X-Men, the first one. It was a good movie. It was something that was rather reserved for the time. That didn't have the great, big, huge action set pieces that we're used to seeing in comic book movies now, but you gotta understand that the budget in this movie was awfully small. They were taking a risk. Fox was taking a risk on this movie because this was something new. Remember, Batman and Robin killed comic book movies for several years. X-Men is responsible for reviving it. Not Blade, not Spider-Man. X-Men is responsible for reviving the comic book movies. X-Men had an 81% on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, I know that people will say, oh, who cares what the critics say? Here's the reality. Rotten Tomatoes does not give the score on their own. Rotten Tomatoes is an aggregate. It's an average. It's an average of all the critic reviews of the movies. So, Rotten Tomatoes doesn't assign the score. The critics, together, as a body of people, assign the score. And critics are paid professionals in evaluating movies. So yes, I agree 100%. Movies are subjective. X-Men had an 81% on Rotten Tomatoes. Maybe you think X-Men sucks, and that's perfectly fine. But we're talking about the consensus. Not what one person thinks, oh, I thought X-Men was horrible. It was nothing like the comics. No, we're talking about the consensus here. The consensus, by professionals who are paid to evaluate movies, is that the first X-Men movie was good at 81%. Let's talk about X-Men 2. X-Men 2 at one point I thought was the best comic book movie ever made. It's not anymore. It might still be in the top 10, but it's not the best comic book movie ever made anymore. But man, is it a good comic book movie. The assault on the mansion, the final battle at the Alkali Lake. There was so much good in X-Men 2. X-Men 2 is a great comic book movie. Still today. It's not the best ever made anymore, but it's a great comic book movie. And guess what? The critics agreed. 85%. 85% on Rotten Tomatoes. So again, the professionals who are paid to evaluate movies came to a consensus that this is a good movie. Alright, now we're at X-Men 3. X-Men 3, I didn't like X-Men 3. There was stuff that I liked in X-Men 3, but overall, I didn't like the movie. It was too disjointed. It was too confused. There were too many storylines going on. The mutant vaccine could have been a storyline. The Dark Phoenix could have been a storyline. There were so many storylines that could have carried their own movie. So instead, they chose to mash them all together and create this very disjointed movie. Guess what? The critics agreed. X3 The Last Stand has a 58% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is a rotten movie. Barely. It's barely a rotten movie by consensus, but it is rotten. Let's go on to the next one on my list. X-Men Origins Wolverine. This was the worst Fox movie that they made. This was the low point. This was as bad as it got. And this actually thwarted their plans to have a series of origin movies, because this movie was so bad. Even the studio knew this movie was bad. The critics agreed. 37% on Rotten Tomatoes. X-Men Origins was a bad movie. There wasn't even a lot to like in it. It was just bad. So let's go ahead and move on to X-Men First Class. X-Men First Class is a fantastic X-Men movie. It's a fantastic comic book movie. Period. It's a good comic book movie. And the critics agreed. 86%. So again, you may hate X-Men First Class. You may think, well, that movie was bad. The reality is that the consensus is that it's a good movie. And we're talking about consensus here. Consensus is that it's a good movie. X-Men First Class. Let's go to Days of Future Past. Days of Future Past is my favorite X-Men movie. I even like it more than Logan. It's my favorite X-Men movie. I thought it was fantastic. Um, so much to like in that movie. Bringing together the First Class and the original X-Men and blending them together seamlessly. This was a fantastic comic book movie, and yes, I think this is one of the top 10 comic book movies ever made right now. Even when you compare it to the MCU, even when you compare it to the DCEU, this is a top 10 comic book movie of all time. X-Men Days of Future Past, and guess what? The critics agreed. 90% on Rotten Tomatoes. That is the second highest rated X-Men movie that there is on Rotten Tomatoes. So again, if we're talking consensus, I gotta keep on saying this because I understand that movies are subjective, and if you don't like Days of Future Past, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to like it. But consensus is that it was a great movie. Let's move on to The Wolverine. I like this movie. There were problems with it, especially in the final act. Final act, it got really comic booky, really silly, and when the whole movie isn't very comic booky, okay, the train scene was pretty comic booky, the bullet train, but when the whole movie for the most part isn't very comic booky, and then you get to the final scene and it's a little ridiculous, that kind of feels out of place, and that's how I felt in this movie. Overall, I liked it. Overall, I did like this movie, but it had a number of problems. And again, the critics agreed, 71%. So, the critics gave this a fresh rating. This was a good movie. Not great, but this was a good movie. And the critics agreed, consensus was that The Wolverine was a good movie. Alright, let's look at X-Men Apocalypse. Alright, I'm going to actually go against the mold. I kind of like X-Men Apocalypse. I didn't love it. It's the worst of the three First Class movies. But I liked it. I liked the Magneto stuff, especially when they found him in the woods. Oh, that was good stuff. So I'm going against the grain. I liked Apocalypse, but we're talking about consensus, and consensus is 48% on Rotten Tomatoes. The X-Men Apocalypse was not a good movie. 48%. So again, we're talking about consensus. Subjectively, I liked it. But when we're talking consensus, most people didn't at 48%. So that was another bad one. Let's go to Deadpool. I think everybody liked Deadpool, right? Deadpool was a phenomenon when it came out. I didn't hear many people at all complaining about the quality of Deadpool, and quite frankly, the critics liked it too, 84%. So consensus is that it's a good movie, and pretty much the chatter on Deadpool was that it's a good movie. So we're not going to spend much time on that. Let's look at Logan. Logan is a wonderful movie. It's not just a great comic book movie. Logan is a great movie. Period. Now, as far as comic book movie goes, I like Days of Future Past more than Logan. But if you take the comic book movie aspect out of it and just evaluate this as a movie, oh my gosh, Logan was phenomenal. One of the best movies that I saw that year. I think that was 2017, right? Yeah. One of the best movies of 2017. So good. This was a fantastic movie. And the critics agree. This is actually the highest rated X-Men movie at 93%. Let's look at Deadpool 2. Deadpool 2 is another movie that I really liked. And I think the chatter on it, was mostly good. Most people liked Deadpool 2. 83%. The critics agreed. So let's look at this. Out of the 11 X-Men movies that they have released in theaters, only 3 of them have had rotten ratings. So by consensus, again, you can hate the X-Men movies. You can say, they were nothing like the comics. I cannot wait until the MCU gets them back and does them right. That's fine. But you can't sit here and tell me that the X-Men movies were bad. You can't sit here and tell me that the consensus on the X-Men movies is that they were bad. The consensus is that they were quite good. 3 out of 11 were rotten. That means 8 were considered to be good movies. Don't tell me that the X-Men movies were bad. You can say you didn't like them. That's fine. But you can't sit here and say, well, everybody says the X-Men movies were bad. The X-Men movie, everybody can't wait till they go to Marvel. No. The X-Men movies were good. The consensus is that they were good. Most people think they were good. The general audience thinks they were good. You might wish they were back with Marvel. But they were good. And guess what? They're back with Marvel. We're only probably a few weeks, maybe a couple months away from the Disney deal being done, and then they're going to wipe this universe out of existence, and they're going to completely reboot the X-Men in the Marvel Universe. Might be the right move, might be the wrong move. Time will tell. X-Men will end with Dark Phoenix and New Mutants. This iteration of the X-Men will end with Dark Phoenix and the New Mutants. And that's fine. They've had a great run. A great run. Nobody can sit here and say that this version of the X-Men didn't have a great run. We're at what? 17 years? 18? No, gosh, we're at almost 19 years now, right? Since, because the first X-Men came out in 2000, I believe. So we're at 19 years that this universe has been in existence. That's almost double what the MCU has done. This group has had a great run. Now that Disney is about to have those Mickey gloves all over them, we are going to see a new version of the X-Men, and it's probably going to be really great. 99% of what Marvel does is great. But let's look fondly back on the X-Men movies. 10, 20 years from now, when we're looking back and evaluating them, let's look back fondly on them, because most of them are good. Most of them are good, some of them are great. X-Men 2, X-Men Days of Future Past, Logan, they're great. And consensus is that they're great. That's not just my opinion, that is consensus. Your opinion might be that they suck. That's fine. It is subjective. But consensus is that they're great. So let's look back on it and have a positive feeling in our hearts for the X-Men movies 10 years from now, when we're watching Wolverine and Beast and Cyclops and Storm and all the X-Men that we love, when we're watching them fight alongside the Avengers in the MCU, and we're having a great time with it and cheering. Let's look back on these X-Men fondly, because they gave us some great movies and they gave us some great times, and quite frankly, I'm going to miss them. So, what do you think? Do you think that this version of the X-Men, these 11 movies, do you think they sucked and that they belong in the scrap heap of cinematic history? Or are you going to have fond memories of these X-Men? Let me know in the comments down below. Hit the subscribe button, and as always, thank you for joining me here on the LQ Review.